Azkuna zentroa Alondiga Bilbaok ongi etorria ematen dizue GUTUN ZURIA Bilbao letren nazioarteko jaialdira. Ondoren, Conversación sobre la conversación solasaldia izango da MARTA SANZ filologo eta idazlea eta Luis López CARRASCO zinemagile eta idazlearen artean. Topaketa honetan, biek beren lanean jorratzen dituzten gaien inguruan hausnartuko dute. Prekarietatea, ustelkeria, fikziozkoa eta utopikoa den sistema aldaezin eta zalantzagarri baten inguruan. Mesedez, itzali telefono mugikorrak eta gozatu elkarrizketaz. Azkuna Centroa Alondiga Bilbao os da la bienvenida a GUTUN ZURIA Bilbao, Festival Internacional de las Letras. A continuación tendrá lugar la conversación titulada Conversación sobre la conversación entre la filóloga y escritora MARTA SANZ y el cineasta y escritor Luis López CARRASCO. En este encuentro reflexionarán en torno a cuestiones que ambos abordan en su trabajo: la precariedad, la corrupción, lo ficticio y lo utópico de un sistema inmutable e incierto. Por favor, es el momento de apagar los teléfonos móviles y disfrutar de la conversación. Azkuna Centroa Alondiga Bilbao welcomes you to GUTUN ZURIA Bilbao International Literature Festival. Now we present the Conversación sobre la conversación between the philologist and writer MARTA SANZ and the filmmaker and writer Luis López CARRASCO. In this meeting, they will reflect on issues that they both address in their work: the precariousness, corruption, the fictitious and the utopian of an immutable and uncertain system. Please, it's time to turn off your mobile phones and enjoy the conversation.
Bueno, pues...
Well, hello everybody, good afternoon, and many thanks to everybody for having come here today, especially on such a rainy afternoon. I think that I would have stayed at home and sitting on the settee, and I think that both Luis and myself are delighted to be here with you people this afternoon, because you are here and also because we feel comfortable, because we've had very few occasions of speaking together, although we work for the same publisher and although we are linked to the same prize. I think it's going to be the first long conversation that we're going to be holding here. So to organize things a little bit, what we had thought is that in order to address everything from the most specific to the most generic in whatever has to do with the conversation on conversation, which sounds like the Marx Brothers. And what we're going to do is we're going to kick off by talking about our own experience and by our impression. First, we're going to be talking about dialogue, in other words, conversations, the conversations of the characters in the what are fundamentally narrative texts, and after that we're going to move on to a much more extensive plane where in the narrative texts what we do is establish encounters of gazes and voices with the people that tell the stories and who receive them in the text. And then there's a much more general and interesting plane that has to do with the connections between the people that write and the readers, or those that write with the literary institution, and if two texts do or not converse with the space of reception, of it's just the authors that really hold that conversation with the men and women readers in a very strange communication between souls. So we're going to be trying to talk about all this, and then we'll see what we'll do. But that is our intention. This is our prior homework, but then we don't know what's going to happen, and we don't know where we're going to be taken by the water of the river. So I'm going to adopt the interviewer role with you. All of this business about dialogues in novels, how do you go about that? Well, firstly, I would like to thank Marta for being here with her this afternoon, because I owe her a lot. And also, I would like to thank you people too for having come here. Many thanks to Azkuna Centroa for the people that have made it possible to hold this festival, where I think we are learning many things. And it is true that I have a career as a filmmaker. Well, I'm not sure if you can call it a career. It's a minor career if you want. But let's kick off by talking about literature with the work in the Desierto Blanco, or the White Desert. I've now premiered in Anagrama, in the publishing house. And as far as dialogue is concerned, I'm not under the impression that my filmmaking practice has an influence on the literary practice or my writing practice. I think that these are two careers that I separated more than 20 years ago, but there are some times when I say that, look, I always address a dialogue from the point of view of naturalism in the works that I have developed. And perhaps this naturalism is connected to feature film projects where the register of this reality and these conversations, or these films where there are lots of conversations, also have to be naturalistic. So this is why I think that the dialogue has that goal of emulating what you're talking about, or establishing a connection with something that is tangible and very identifiable, because the literature that I'm exploring now is connected to the historic time. Although I was thinking about this, well, you've written scripts but I've used recording devices for future projects. So I've used technology to record orality and then try to transcribe it. So it's like trying to documenting the spoken word, even if you do it through the written word. So in other words, that's what I'm trying to do. That's what I'm trying to develop. And please, you tell me now, what is your connection with dialogues? I've shot no films. I don't have that double take or that double perspective that Luis has, because I've watched lots of films, but I've never made films, because I think that you have to know how to tell people what they have to do, and you have to organize things well. And I'm very bad at issuing commands, and I'm not saying this as a flaw, but it's something that perhaps I should do much better. But when I started to write, I found that it was one of the most difficult things in this world, and I think that it was very difficult to include a dialogue with opportunity, or including a dialogue that is not your typical disclosure, that is that such and such a character is the killer. So in other words, that it's not only fireworks, but I didn't want it to be as non-transcendental as the dialogues that we hold in our daily lives, non-stop. Many times we speak and we have a completely empty discourse, and even though this discourse does have a meaning attached to it, but I find that it's very difficult to dialogue, and I think that in the first text that I wrote, it's something that I avoided. And then I started to have somewhat strange feelings, because what I noticed is that writing a text in the first person singular, me or I, and introducing the direct style, well, all of a sudden this becomes an anomaly. And it's, rhetorically speaking, it's something that doesn't really make any sense. But why don't you reproduce conversations between other people indirectly, that Luis told me that he saw such and such? How can it be that in a work that is in first person singular, this happens? And then I was also under the impression that this naturalism, that this need to reflect the spoken word, that puts you in contact with a historic moment or with a social class, as we said in philology, with the diatopic and diaphasic varieties, and with the abstract elements of the language. But this is really one of the most artificial things of literature, because if the analysis of in the analysis of the real conversation, we people mumble a lot, we repeat things, and we are destroying our syntax non-stop. But when we write these dialogues, we always have a high degree of sophistication. In other words, we become much more stylistic. And this is my connection with dialogues, which I've normalized a little bit more. And I'm sure that you've seen this, and you too, Luis, I'm sure that you've seen The Fallen Lips by Kismaki. Well, I like these filmmakers and the writers that hold an absolutely artificial kind of dialogue. Yes, no, and I like you. My dog is called Chaplin, or you have to stop drinking, whatever. And I like this artificiality imposed on something that's so natural, because I think that literary communication is just like that. And when we read a literary text, what we are trying to do is we're trying to establish a relationship with it, and we are interpreting it as we would interpret a conversation in real life. But at the same time, what we must notice is that there are filters filters, there are distortion, and there are rhetoric and formal elements which at the end of the day are the ones that give a meaning to that conversation. And then I love dialogues of thrillers, that they are this issue of the femme fatale and the detective, and it's as if they were copulating, and I'm sorry for using the expression. It's all about seeing who has got it bigger or smaller. Well, this, I think it's true that in this respect, filmmaking, well, I still remember that there was, I'm under the impression that I have read Spanish literature 20 or 25 years ago, and I'm under the impression that these dialogues, for me, the problem is that it's when it's neither one thing nor the other, as if the register is not anti-naturalistic, or, well, but it could be the opposite. In other words, there's an attempt at achieving naturalism that looks strange, because it is true that it can produce that effect. What you see in the realistic novels of the 19th century. When you're reading a novel that takes place in Spain in 2002, and when you see it, it seems that you're reading English translated. It's something that I always see, or you're watching a dialogue of a film, but where there's no local flavour, and there's not anything of any particular interest. But there is something that, for instance, I was just thinking about my most recent novel, and there is something, for example, that I've always liked a lot in the case of certain authors, and which apparently it has to do with a debate or a doubt we had in the past, and that is that if a novel contains many dialogues, it becomes theatrical, as if the novel couldn't incorporate certain loquaciousness. And there is times, for instance, I still remember, this is something that there was a book by Philip Roth where there's a person who's driving and talking all the time, non-stop, and one of the critiques was that it looked very theatrical. It was a novel that eventually became a film, La Vida Perra de Juan Narboni. It's a torrential dialogue that is very colloquial too, and very lively. And this is what I like. In other words, I enjoy breaking up that balance between narration and description when you have 100 pages of somebody that is very mad about something, or the opposite, somebody that's telling you, is talking about detection techniques for illnesses affecting cats or felines. And this is something that I've never found is theatrical, but I think that a novel, the good thing is that it incorporates it perfectly well. But when you were talking before about this orality, this overwhelming orality, and this dramatic style, I still remember El Jarama by Sanchez Fernosio, and there's also an element of guilt mentioned by the critiques, because they say that this is like a tape recorder novel, as if you'd connected the tape recorder. Well, the term I used now in Spanish, magnetofono, sounds as if it comes from the Archaeology Museum. I'm sorry, but things are going far too quickly for me on the technological front. And there are some things that I think work perfectly well, and I like them a lot. And in fact, I think that in the case of that part that has to do with our job, that is related to listening, because without listening it's impossible for there to be a conversation, even though we are in a world where it seems that the only thing we have to do is tell our truths, and we have to be we have to ignore whatever other people say, so that makes conversations impossible. And on, you know, that in the means of transport, you know that we contemporary writers are like salesmen, because we are traveling from one place to another non-stop. So as regards transport, when I'm moving around, I'm listening to people's conversations, and I feel ashamed. I mean, I don't want to write down in a notebook what I'm listening to that at that time, but some of them I do remember, because these conversations are magnificent. I remember I was on a plane somewhere, and there was a young child that kept on saying, I want to have food, I want to have food, to her mother. And what they brought was these noodles or instantaneous spaghettis or whatever it was, some kind of horrible food. Anyway, call it whatever you want. And the stewardess came along and gave the child chopsticks, and the child said, I'm sorry, but I don't really use chopsticks, and this is a horrible child. And I think that I did include what she said somewhere. And the other day I was on the high-speed train and there was a group of women there. I'm not sure if it was one of these stag parties or something, and a gentleman approached them and to describe some kind of problem, and what they told the guy said, look, excuse me, but we're positive and we don't like you non-conformist people, so just leave us alone and go away. And there are things you have to react to, and in one way or another, in a naturalist manner or in a more sophisticated manner, I think that these are things that eventually appear in the novels we write. And then there's another form of orality that is not exactly related to dialogues and conversations, and I think that the example you gave us of La Perrajera de Juanita Narbonea is marvelous. If you haven't seen it, Esperanza Roy plays a wonderful part in the film, but that is a monologue. It's a monologue given by a lady, but it's a relatively monologue, relatively speaking, because she's speaking to somebody. Because when there's need and when there's that torrent of a voice in the first person singular that talks and talks and talks, we then move on to the other narrative plane, and what we notice is that those voices, I don't know, what they need to do away with their guilt, or they have to reproach you, like in the case of Cinco Horas con Mario by Miguel Delibes, or they, I don't know, or they need whatever. They need to justify themselves because they've killed somebody. And that's where we make things even more complex from the narrative perspective. What we notice is that many of the things written in the first person singular in these narratives that are either protagonists or witnesses, what they are trying to do is they are trying to attract the attention, not exactly of the reader, but they are trying to attract the attention of an interposed figure that may coincide with another character in the novel, or may operate as an interposed figure. And what that figure is doing, in my opinion, is underscoring the moral value of the works. In other words, the need to tell something to somebody because you have a feeling of guilt. Atonement is another example. And this issue of narrations that remind us that communication, internal communication processes of the narrative artifacts are reproducing external communication processes, really. And it's something that I'm really interested in a lot. And there's something else that I'm also equally interested in, and it's how in these first-person singular narrators, as a reader, what we have to see is the difference that exists between the gaze and the voice. Because when I read a text written in the first person, I'm thinking about who's telling this, and I'm thinking, who is he telling it for, and who is he telling it to? And that sometimes makes me differentiate between the psychology of the person that is speaking and their intention, and how there's a little gap there in between that separates it from the voice that we are hearing in books. And that discovery for me, not only as a writer but also as a reader, was absolutely marvelous. Yes, I fully agree with that, and it showed me how to make much more, to get much more out of what I was reading. And in El Desierto Blanco, in the wonderful novel by Luis López Carrasco, and I must say that I knew nothing about you, and I'm sorry I hadn't even seen your film, my fault, but when I read your book I knew absolutely nothing about you, and I found that it was a very peculiar book. And it was an astonishing book. because you dared to contradict the rigor of a novel instead of saying, look, a novel has to be such and such. And in your book, Luis, what we have stories, but they're not really stories because everything converges in a single story. There's utopia, there's dystopia, there's social critique, and there are possibilities of being very optimistic in the literary word. And there's something that I liked, is that how your characters establish a dialogue between themselves in relation to science fiction scripts, how you include something that is so meta-literary to something that is so natural, and how you apply it to conversation between friends. For instance, on New Year's Eve, which is when that takes place. Well, thank you very much. Well, yes, there are times when the dialogue can be a vector for a number of conversations, or it could, well, the idea is that it should operate at all of those levels. So, in other words, that organically speaking, it be within the situation that has been addressed, so that it works narratively and dramatically, and so that it can characterize what is going on, and at the same time, and so that you can put into circulation a number of issues that talk about that historic moment, because it is New Year's Eve, but it's also the digital blackout of TDT, and you're trying to tune your TV set again. And this is what makes them think about the dystopias that say that the world is coming to an end. And in fact, I worked on a collage structure, which is the New Year's Eve dinner, and the speakers interrupt each other. And somebody said to me, well, you can tell that you're a filmmaker because it all looks very film related. In other words, that sequence. And you can see that each line of dialogue or the conversations are interconnected with 8 people speaking at the same time. You can follow what they're saying, but they don't stop interrupting each other. So there's sort of cacophony. And I thought that this is something that I took from Catherine Mansfield, really. And then I was just remembering another thing by Bavessa of workers that are repairing railway tracks. And you're told that you're a filmmaker, and you say, I don't know. It's like if you see War and Peace, and then you say, well, you can see that Tolstoy saw some of Spielberg's films, because he describes all the action. And this is something that it connects me with something that you mentioned previously, and which has to do with your most recent novel, Persianas Metálicas Bajan de Golpe. And there's a moment that I believe is absolutely brilliant and virtuous, which is very naturalistic, and that is the 4 elderly ladies that are at the nursing home. And what they do, each one of them, then, well, in fact, we can recover all this business about interposed narrations, because it's a very interesting thing, where, well, all of these narrators are giving their own version of what's been going on. But in Persianas Metálicas Bajan de Golpe, there's a beautiful element there, where there are different chapters of a serial that everybody of the Landing Blues Rhapsody, which is what the country or the world or the continent is called, in which the novel takes place, from which China has been excised, and which can only be used for recipes and for a little bit more, that, yes, so that the earth can be flat. And then later on we'll talk about how you talk about telenostalgia, because I think that you make a wonderful prognosis there. And there's a story showing 4 elderly women. One of them goes and see her mother, who has a significant cognitive deficit, and how this connection is established, and it's perfect. Because there's a first voice, a second voice, a third voice, and then a third elderly person appears, and a 4th elderly lady. And what I'm very interested is in how you play with very cultist registers, and very colloquial registers too, with rude words between inverted commas, and how an elderly lady comes along slapping somebody else. And I found that that was magnificent. So you are naturalistic there, yes, totally. And I'm also very grateful for your interpretation, because all of this business about the elderly ladies at the nursing home in Persianas Metálicas Bajan de Golpe, the fact is that I visited my mother-in-law with my husband. We went to the nursing home where she had been admitted to because she had a cognitive deficit, as you pointed out, and she was there for several years. And of course I was listening to what they were saying there. And I remember perfectly well that my mother-in-law was a wonderful lady. She went to the hairdresser when she was basically losing it, unfortunately, and told the hairdresser, look, make my hair tall because I'm too short. And what the women said to each other. And then they were also, there was lots of sour grapes and people were defending their own spaces, because sometimes these things are represented in an idyllic manner, and the truth is that there's no happiness at these places. And these are people that are losing their memory, and it means that they are fully aware of their space and what they have to defend, and they are very worried about their own territory. So that's something that I heard, and this appeared in my book because I believe that this book also reflects upon that. In other words, and how care in our society, how the concept has changed, the concept of aging and all of these other things. But there's something that I'm very, very interested in, and I think that Luis and myself have seen this, and this is what I mentioned to you before, how on the one hand, what we try to do, we try to transfer, or we try to represent in our literary or film artifacts or whatever, we're trying to reflect external conversations. But the marvelous thing about this is that when these artifacts become in subjects for conversations, and I still remember how at the home of my paternal family, my grandfather Ramon, he was a mechanic. I always talk about the mechanic that loved music. He was a good mechanic because he liked music, and I think I still remember how at my grandfather's house, culture of films or whatever, I don't know, or songs by Manolo Escobar, compared to La Doloresa or operettas, were not a matter of a conversation. It was a big dispute because my grandfather took it very seriously, and if you criticized Manolo Escobar, he would kick you out of the house. I remember a birthday of mine when my grandfather came along and we were playing a song by Joan Manuel Serrat, and he was very classical and very intolerant. He said, stop that immediately, because if you keep on playing that record, that means that you don't love me. Because the cultural options reached that extreme. He was very enthusiastic, and he was a mechanic by profession. And there's something marvelous in all of that, and that is then when books got out of the spheres of literature, and here don't when you get out of these sanctums, we reach out to other areas, other places, and I'm very, like for instance with a book like Clavicula, I went to hospitals, and I went to hospitals to speak to doctors and psychiatrists. We're talking about this tremendous distance that sometimes takes place at the office of a doctor, because what is happening to you, you are the patient. And what you do is you tend to magnify that because it's happening to you, because it's your little spot, and perhaps it's the first time you felt that kind of pain. Whereas for the person that is sitting opposite you, who's a healthcare professional, it's something that is routine, even if it is cancer, for instance. But this does form part of his daily activities, but there's a distance that is very violent. So if for me, if a literary text, if it can take that leap, and if it can go beyond the speciality or of the lovers of literature to reach out to a hospital, or to reach out to a secondary school, or for instance with Clavicula, I went to speak to the association of people affected by the rapeseed oil, and they did crowdfunding in Murcia at the hospital. I'm not sure it was the Fantalena or whatever the name of the place was, to speak to the people affected by rapeseed oil. And I thought that that was wonderful, because at the end of the day, in a world in which, unfortunately, I think that the connection between readers and texts, and I'm saying unfortunately, because for me it's like a loss, because I'm come from my own analog experience, so the connection between the literary texts and the readers is changing, and I'm not sure if it's for better or for worse, but in any case it is changing. So in this world that is undergoing a crisis in a certain respect, literature is reviving, is coming back to life in social circles, and I think that that's something that is absolutely wonderful.
¿Tú has tenido
Qué bonito.
experiencias de esto?
I've had these kind of experiences. Well, the thing is, my book was published very recently, so my best experiences that I found in this bookshop, they organized like a reading club with teenagers. I kind of see it differently because when you have the experience of making a book, then there is something more personal. It's also more of a lonely activity. And then maybe you're not that sort of engaged, even sentimentally, with the work. And maybe that is more yours than when you are doing a film, even though in my films, and in the future, apparently I'm talking about a party with youngsters in the 80s, or then I talk about industrial recovery, about how in 92 the Murcia parliament was put in flames. Well, this is like, talking about the B side of something that was to the Spanish society a very important in history. Even though this theory is very much in my mind, then there's something that is very personal. And I think in my book, The Future, El Futuro, I wanted to really see what my parents were doing at the time when I was born. So I think there is something very, very intimate there. So even though I shoot it in Cartagena, I come from Murcia, so I wanted to really protect how people talk there, how people are there. It's not like people that went to school with me, but like people in my neighborhood. So this is how I've done it. So I come from a tradition of experimental filmmaking and from a non-fiction that has got different spaces, and these are like little niches and they are considered a bit elite. This is like a contemporary art museum or experimental filmmaking cinemas, and this places you in a circuit when you convince yourself that you are part of a minority, and that somehow is a construct. Then there is a rationale behind it. There is a precise way to talk about some works, and I also work as a film critic myself, so I was very good at talking. So my films seem to be better than they were because I would defend them very well. I would advocate for my films very well, and it's very sad that I would have to talk about my own films in a conversation or a debate. I'd rather like to go watch my film and then get going. Then some other friends of mine were doing similar things, but they were not that good at speaking. They didn't have the jargon, so their films didn't seem to be that good. And then I've realized one of my best experiences was when I could show my films in not the common spaces, like in my first long film called Los Materiales, the Materials, super experimental, black and white film where some people are talking but you never see them and you only see it written, and it is about the dump in Riaño, and people from Riaño came thinking, they came to the MUSAC, the Museum of Art, Contemporary Art, Modern Art in Logroño, and they thought that, they would see themselves speaking, but that was not the case. It was really very Martian. It was something very alien kind of thing where they would talk, but you would not see them. So this was not the documentary they were expecting. And then dialogue that we started there after the film was a very interesting experience, because there was this woman, and the woman, she had a shop in the village, and she said, I watched your film, it was black and white, and I realized that it is black and white because everything is now dead in Riaño. So they were speaking from a standpoint that to me is very important. And I think that in filmmaking, there are all these experiments and circuits, and there's a film festival that is called Edges, Márgenes. And I told him, come on, don't give it that name. I have another friend, a filmmaker. He made a film that was censored by the Santander Bank. I don't know if you know this film. And I thought it should be screened on Spanish TV. So we sort of say it's okay to just follow a certain circuit, and it makes you think you are really cool because you are screened at the Guggenheim Museum or the Musac. So sometimes it's very good to go somewhere else. Well, according to what you've said, Luis, I largely feel very much identified with what you've said. As I see it, we doing this kind of cultural jobs, we always have a space of reception. So we're not thinking about an ideal reader or about a particular type of market. This might lead to errors if you say, no, this person is writing exclusively literature, and the goal being, or the target being, women in between 40 and 50 who suffer from a knee injury. No, it is not that at all. I do not write thinking about an ideal reader. I do not at all write considering readers as customers that are going to consume my books. Otherwise, I would write differently. But I think if you don't have this sort of reception space, that is people sort of welcoming my books, then what you do will be sort of void, and it will not be communicating at all. And this is what culture has to do, communicate with people. So when we have this vision of a culture that it should be something social, political, and transformative, I think we think that culture is based on reality, but also serves to build realities. And then there should be some ways to show sort of dark areas. I think we're living a terrible paradox, because oftentimes, since in arts and literature, the form and the content go together, to show, to put some light into those cracks in the darkness. You try to be experimental, and sometimes you use the language that you think is not going to reach the persons you are aiming at. Those people from Riaño, you mentioned also the home helpers that I mention often in my books, and I think this is a prejudice. And is really of very classist, because this has to do with the capacity of human beings to feel moved by what we see or listen to, even if we do not completely seize it, we do not completely understand it. Like this lady you mentioned, this is black and white because everything is dead. And in book clubs, to me, book clubs are wonderful to really get to know what is going on. You have the impression that your texts are too dark and you have to constantly explain them, but other times you really learn a lot. Sometimes you say, well, my God, they're not that complicated. Maybe I have a prejudice in relation to the intelligence of the people reading me. And in this book club in Úbeda, there's a bookshop called The Secret Agent in Úbeda, and I am promoting this bookshop, but I feel like it because they're very good. A lady, in 3 minutes, she explained to me better than I could have done so the sentimental relationship of the female characters of my book, these shutters that close suddenly, persianas que bajan de golpe. She came there and she said, well, this is sexist, this is about violence, and this is a commentary about this daughter of Spanish Andalusian singer, how we make ours discourse that is not ours. So I think these kind of conversations is what I am meaning, and I think that is what is really wonderful in cinema and literature. Then when I said that when this film text or literature text get away from our own circles and sort of move people, I also have the opposite impression. I think that lately, in recent times, some books become very popular or people really like them because the subject is very right at that time, because it is part of the current news, and it doesn't matter how you write them. And it doesn't matter your viewpoint, or it doesn't matter it is a piece of journalism or literature, how you are representing that. The other thing is that you are talking about such a matter at the right time, like talking about menopause. It's important to talk about menopause, but you do not eat in the same way when you are writing a piece of literature or when you are doing a scientific article or a documentary. So these are different ways of knowledge, and I think we're living in a society where the gaze, the literatures and the cinemas gaze are a bit dormant nowadays. Well, yes, you've touched upon many subjects. Yeah, I often see these silly TV shows where there's lots of gossiping, but I like them because they keep me alive. Then there is this sort of formal structure that we have to follow. There was the idea that if you want to do a creative piece of work that will have an impact in society, I don't know whether you can do something creative considering whether it's going to impact society or not. I remember that we're always wondering whether this possibility of transforming with your work and opening the way to some conversations that are no longer opened. And this is why I like these grandmothers that were sort of saying, if you do that, I'm going to hit you. Because life is always more complex, and I like art's sort of portraying it. When I did this film called The Future, El Futuro, it reproduces something that was shot in 16mm in a party in 1992. It seems it was not well shooted, and it is a party. The music plays very high, so you cannot really hear anything unless for 3 seconds in between 2 songs. So I remember Victor Leonari was criticizing me, saying that I was fake, because I said there was a critical vocation in my film, but that I was very fascist, and I consider that the content should be massive for it to reach the mass. And I think it was terrible when there was the premiere of this film in Sevilla, and a 55-year-old guy, when he came out, he said, all my friends have been portrayed in your film and they're all dead. And that really struck him hard. And well, you know, I have many other references from other countries where this was the case with their filmmaking, and it's not the case in our literature. I think it's very classicist to say that non-conventional forms maybe cannot find a specific kind of audience. I think that all cultural discourses that are part of a certain community end up having a social impact whether they want it or not. The mere fact that we are now talking here in front of an audience, the fact that you have a film called The Future, or that I have this book called These Suddenly Dropping Shutters or Blinds, I think everything has a meaning, because in the field of culture we have many voices that echo, that talk to another voices, that somehow reproduce what will be the mainstream discourse, the standard discourse, and they sort of support it or ignore it or refuse it. So I think what is impossible is not to have a meaning. I think what is impossible is not to sort of create a thread of communication, and I think what is impossible really is that there is no meaning or communication. And what you mentioned about the future, about the noise, I think we're living in a society that is full of noise. So I think at the end of the day, what is important is to find the little, you know, drops that will lead us through this labyrinth. Those breadcrumbs that will guide us. And also, this is related to the lack of communication. I guess the main character holding coffin in the catcher in the rye, he wants to talk to somebody in the middle of the night, and from the very beginning he goes, do not ever tell anything to anybody. And then he is there talking for 200 pages. And what we are talking in this novel is about the impossibility to set a conversation in a society that is altered by alienation. Holden tries to talk to a lady he is dancing with, and there's always music disturbing him or something else. So we're trying to give an answer to that question, and this is a metaphor I frequently use. We're trying to find the perfect note, and we never do. Well, I want to mention a specific moment in your book that is related to dissonance, and it is the following line. Now the world is more difficult. Women do not suffer from lack of hope, but they do suffer from sadness. Sometimes they are very, very unfortunate, and they have this capacity to sort of see the catastrophes approaching. Well, I think that was the perfect cherry to this conversation. Yes, talking about the white desert, and there is an episode there where they are talking, it is New Year's Eve, and there is a wonderful moment when they discover a landscape. And I'm not going to unveil the texture of this landscape, but it is full of artifacts that are recording conversations and images. This novel is full of beautiful, extremely beautiful images. And I dearly encourage you to read it. So now it's up to you. If you have questions or you would like to talk with us, it is your time. You have the floor.
Ahí, hay una.
Hola,
Hola.
muchas gracias.
Well, thank you very much to both of you. I have a question. In your creative process, when you're creating your books, how do you go about the conversations with your characters? Because I guess that sometimes they talk to you and something you do not really think willingly how they're going to talk among themselves. Maybe sometimes they kind of sort of come to you, and sometimes maybe you are not precisely sitting in front of your laptop, or you don't have a notebook, but then the characters are talking to you. How do you manage this? I am really analog, so I always carry a notebook with me, and it is good for everything. To give a conference, to write down things that dawn on me suddenly as I go and come, to see what am I going to write in my next column at El País. So this is good for everything, this notebook. This is part of my creative process, if you want to call it like that. But to me, what is fundamental in order to write dialogues and so, it is to keep my eyes and my ears opened, wide opened, and to trying to be permeable to the noises in the street, to you here at home. I wrote this novel that is called Black, 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 and it's based on all my neighbors. And I was lucky enough that my neighbors did not read a lot because some friends of mine were telling me they're going to kill your cats. But this is about being very open, and also to be flexible enough to realize that while you are writing, because writing is also a way of living and a way of knowing, maybe then some subjects, ideas, conversation that you did not expect will come to you, and they just show up. And they show up because you are using your pencil or you are typewriting strongly. This is how it is for me. I could not give you any more complex explanation because this is the way it is. You have to keep an eye on things, keep your ears also open to the world, and be able to communicate your fears, your viewpoint of the world as you are learning, as you go, as you learn. I think this is what really defines this work we do, writing. I don't think I could add anything to what she said, to what Marta said. This morning in the conversation, Litzmeyer told Brenda Navarro, you are like a sponge, and year after year you are sort of accumulating, absorbing things. So things come to you, you keep them, they're somewhere in you, then they live with you, you sort of think about them, turn them upside down. This may lead to a line, or maybe somebody tells you something and you try to transcribe that, but there you are mediating, you're adding your stand in the world, and years later it might come out and might be part of what you do naturally. There is this mixture of spontaneity and what you sort of do voluntarily. There was a teacher at the Basque University, Zunzunegui. He would say that when you're going to make a film, we always have to ask ourselves, how do you want to relate to, the random nature of things? How do you then turn that into something material? You may use different techniques, but it is what Marta said, really. And there's something very interesting, says Marta, in reference to your question. Sometimes these conversations we have end up in a novel, how novels might lead to conversations outside the text. And then there is something also wonderful. Out of some conversations, we might produce some novels. And this is a true story. The novel that I mentioned, Black, 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 is after I was talking to my dad and I was shortlisted for the Nadal Award and I got nowhere. I gave up my job because then I thought I would be able to be swimming in a golden pool and so on, but it took me nowhere. And then my dad told me, why don't you do like everybody else? Why don't you write a polar? And I think you should call it Black, Black, Black. And that means that I am very obedient and that I do as my father tells me. Then, after that, I produced a book. So apart from this anecdote, what I mean is sometimes you have a conversation with your friends and then you think about it and you say, why shall I not talk about this? Maybe I should sort of get further into this topic. This is how it goes.
Estáis poco conversadores, ¿eh? Nosotros aquí deslumbrados.
Sí.
Here we are, blinded by these lights. And I think you're all shy. There's something I forgot to say, and I think I have to say it here in Bilbao. You don't know how many people really are writing now in Murcia. You have to read those writers from the region in Spain called Murcia. Really, it is booming, this region, not only with Luis López Carrasco, Diego Sánchez Aguilar, with a novel called Those That Listen, Los que Escuchan, when we've been talking about noise, then Miguel Ángel Hernández, Begoña Méndez. She's an adopted Murcian. Then Jiménez Sánchez, Cristina Morano, there are many, many writers, a great poet, Daniel Espejo. We cannot see it from a distance to understand why this is happening, but really Murcia is booming from a literature point of view. Maybe this is the fruit of some conversations that we've been having, and also many illustrators, many graphic designers.
Sorry, they're asking questions without a microphone, apparently.
¿Estarías pensando, por ejemplo, en hacer una película de tu libro?
Pues gracias por...
Thanks for the question, is the answer. Well, the truth is no. And it's something that I would like to explain because of what I said previously. And as far as I know about writing and filmmaking, but what I write, I think exclusively that its end result is going to be something connected to literature. Because anything that has to do with fiction, with the imaginations, I said that I was going to do so through literature. Because I was writing scripts when I was 18 or 19, when I was with like David Lynch, but I didn't have any resources to write those scripts, and things were piling up. And then I worked in the field of directing films. You're the supervisor. You have to deal with the production. You have to make sure that everybody is properly coordinated, and you have the programming guys behind you, and that is very tough. And that made me see how difficult things are. And that started to block my imagination, because I started to write a script and I said, it rains. And then, wait a minute, no, if it rains, I have to call Romani's, who's going to charge me 200,000 euros. No, it doesn't rain then, if I have to spend money. So 3 girls that leave the building with umbrellas. Now, wait a minute, Cornejo has the parasols, and I have to call him up. So that made me decide, because I enjoyed reading a lot, and I did was develop everything from the literary point of view. So this left a big gap, very interesting gap, for films to be something completely different, something that had to do with meeting up with somebody else, or with and getting people together under certain conditions, from which interaction conversations are going to arise, and these conversations are going to take me to places that my imagination or my intelligence could not take me to. So it's all this opening up to the unknown. It's to the material character of the photographic image based on fiction, and whatever's experimental was conducive to the kind of films that I've shot. But I'd have to be paid lots of money to shoot these films. But anyway, thanks for the question. Anyway, well, if you will allow me to say a couple of things here, although this really concerns Luis more than me, I think that there's a sort of overvaluation of narrativity. So it is true that there is a convergence between literature and filmmaking, which is the narrative. It is about telling stories. It's about the plot. But then I think that the literature and cinema have very specific languages and very specific textures too. And there are novels that, if they are adapted to the cinema, they are not really telling you what you want to tell through literature. And what really is funny is that when you write a novel, you say, well, you're asked, do you want this to be transformed into a film? Well, possibly yes, especially those of us that are film goers. But they never ask the question the other way around. They never ask a filmmaker, would you like this to be transformed into a novel? So I think that's something we have to start thinking about. And I'm going to adapt films to literature. That sounds cool. I think it's a great idea. Thank you. Well, okay then. Well, we've come to the end. Thank you all very much. Thank you for your attention and for coming here this afternoon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Gracias, Luis.